Good evening. Welcome to the September 27th Village Board Work Session. This meeting is now called to order. We'll begin with the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening. I'm going to open by just talking about a letter that I'm going to be mailing out tomorrow on behalf of the Village Board of Trustees. We don't often comment on issues of national politics, but came to our attention recently that there's the potential for a significant, they're calling it the health center funding cliff, which would have a really devastating effect on the Open Door, which obviously the Open Door is founded here in Ossining, and they have a number of family health centers in Westchester and Putnam County, and they are looking at possibly losing 70% of their federal funding, which is several $1 million and would affect thousands of people in Ossining and surrounding communities. And so I reached out to Lindsay Farrell, the executive director there, and said, what can we do to help? And one of her suggestions was, actually, I said, can we write a letter? And that's what we're doing. And as soon as I shared it with my fellow trustees on the board, they immediately said, yes, absolutely, I'm supportive of this. So the letter's been drafted, and we're going to send it out tomorrow to all of our representatives in Washington and the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, and also send it to our fellow elected officials, the chief electeds of the other municipalities that have Open Door centers in them, in hopes that they will send out a similar letter, a similar plea to our folks in Washington that they take action to preserve this funding that's so essential for the health and well-being of so many Ossining residents. So thank you to everyone for being so immediately supportive of that so that we can get that out. And Jamie will take care of putting that information out for everyone, for the elected officials and locally and in Washington. Any other announcements? Sir.
This Saturday night, music at the Elks Lodge. Mary Mancini and Mary Otaka will be performing, along with Mike Caruso, as well as Phil Battiston. Mary Otaka is a world-class accordion player, and his wife Mary is a world-class singer, and it should be a great evening of entertainment. It's this Saturday at the Elks Lodge at 7:30. Also, give you a heads up, the Ossining Second Saturday Jazz Series starts up again on October 14th, and that'll be every second Saturday from this October through June of next year. So keep your second Saturdays open for live jazz music here in Ossining. Thank you.
Anyone else? And with that, I'll turn it over to Village Manager Debbie McDonald.
Thank you very much. The first item on our agenda tonight is to discuss the noise ordinance that Stuart has been working on, so I'm going to turn this over to him to discuss it.
I'll talk in a very low. No, I won't.
I like that.
Just to, and I gave each of you a memo that I put together, but just a little background. I had gotten a call a number of weeks ago from an engineering firm that wanted to place permanent generators outside of Scarborough Manor at 16 Rockledge. And the concern that they expressed is that when those generators would be tested, they would exceed the village's noise limit, which is 45 decibels during the day, and I think it's 65 decibels on it works that way. It's 65 decibels during the day, and 45 decibels at night. That's within a residential area, and it's slightly higher if it's in a commercial zone. And the specifications for the generators that they proposed to put in, and those would be two generators, were between 73 and 75 decibels when operational. And the concern that they had was that if, in fact, they are testing this equipment, they would be in a situation of potentially being in violation each time they tested it. One of the questions that came up, simply put, is how often will you be testing the equipment? I went online and checked the specifications for the particular type of generators that they have, and actually there was nothing in there as to the amount of time they need to do it. But what I then did is looked at what other municipalities have with regard to generators and noise ordinances. A couple of things to note. Our zoning code is in fact silent with regard to generators. Most other municipalities that have specifically have noise ordinances that relate to generators have it in relation to their zoning code. They require that there be certain setbacks, that there be certain requirements as to where they be placed. And a few of them, as I mentioned in this memo, require, for example, that it can only be operated once a week for 45 minutes at that time. Another says once a week for an hour at a time. They also have certain decibel limits ranging from 60 decibels up to 80, but it can only be operated during that particular period of time. One thing we also do not have in our code is, under the noise ordinance, is in fact an emergency provision. The only emergency provision we have in the noise code is that in the event that there is a storm of some sort, be it rain, snow, or whatever, you can use your snow blowers, your chainsaws, and things like that for 24 hours after the end of the event without any consideration of the noise ordinance. But there's nothing with regard to generators. And it may be something that this board would want to look at, but what I've given you here are what we have in some of the different municipalities. And again, it should be kept in mind that in terms of judging the amount of sound, the village's ordinance is clear is that it goes from the nearest property line. So it doesn't go directly from where that particular location is. However, it's also to be noted that because Scarborough Manor is a residential and it's actually a multifamily location, it's actually slightly different because there the sound level determination is to be made, in the case of multifamily housing, at the location of the dwelling unit of the parcel in or which the noise is received. So in fact, that could be much closer than the nearest property line. And that's, that's specifically in our code, chapter 173. Right, correct. Now, the various other municipalities that have codes that relate specifically to generators, Scarsdale has a 70 decibel limit measured 23 feet from the unit, except in certain residential districts where it can only be 66 decibels. I do want to point out that the specific type of equipment that is proposed for this location, they provided us with the decibel counts, and that was again between 73 and 75. So if the board were to look at something with a lower decibel limit, they would, the folks at Scarborough Manor would have to come up with some equipment that would be in fact less than that, or come within that code, because otherwise they'd be exceeding it. The most detailed ordinance actually is Mount Pleasant, because they actually have it set up by both residential and commercial. They require site plan approval for their generators, particularly on commercial properties. But one of the things that they have, which is important here, they have a 60 decibel limit, and that they say that it can only be run for testing and maintenance during daytime hours or at a time prescribed by planning or the building inspector. And what all of these ordinances say is that it must be run in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. Since other ones talk about that it has to be run maybe once a week for 45 minutes, my presumption is that that's probably what the manufacturer's specs are. It doesn't have to be more than that. So at the most you'd be looking, except in an emergency, you have two generators here. If they operate both at the same time, it's just for anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour weekly. If you're going to do it separately, then it potentially is up to 2 hours a week for the two different units. But that's something that this board can obviously look at. The village of Port Washington North, I did not know there was a Port Washington North.
I didn't know that either.
I knew there was a
grew up in
Port
that area.
Washington.
Wow.
They permit maintenance operations between the hours of 9 and 5, not to exceed once a week for a maximum period of 45 minutes. And they are also at a 60 decibel limit. New Rochelle is a 70 decibel limit. The village of Muncie Park, which is out on Long Island, is 80 decibels. And Great Neck out on Long Island is no more than 30 minutes in any 7-day period can the equipment be operated. So And again, as I mentioned, most of these municipalities tie this into their zoning ordinance. And I did have an opportunity to speak with Joe Agostinelli this evening, and he confirmed that there is nothing in the zoning code specifically that relates to generators, and that we have no setback requirements, and generally they're not enforcing the setback anyway, because if someone wanted to put a generator, particularly in some of the residential neighborhoods, they never meet the setback requirements as is, given what the small amount of space. But what this board may want to consider is if we're looking at a change potentially to the zoning code, to include somewhere within there provisions that relate to generators. I just point that out because the basis for that would be, bless you,
Thank you.
to provide certain requirements as to what can be done, as to where the generators should be located, should they have certain types of sound baffling equipment around them, be they bushes or actually types of equipment that can be done there, which I understand is the case with regard to 16 Rockledge. The board could also, if it decided to, not do anything vis-a-vis the zoning code, but simply make a change to the noise ordinance, which would include a provision relating to generators. We do have provisions in the code currently that relate to domestic tools and equipment, chainsaws, but it really doesn't apply to this. We do have a section that relates to air conditioning units, which does not apply to this. And if the board wanted to do that, they could put a decibel limit there, as well as include a particular period of time that the equipment would have to be operated. And that's various options that are open to this board. Board could also decide not to do anything, just leave things as they are. But as I said, this came up because it was an inquiry from some folks who are planning the work at 16 Rockledge and wanted to be proactive because they're concerned that their machinery will in fact exceed the noise limits. So that's where it is. And as I said, given that there is no emergency provision in our noise ordinance other than for a weather-related emergency, and that's only for a 24-hour span, it may be something that the board may want to consider at least expanding that to the extent of, if, for example, someone has a portable generator which exceeds the limit, that they can at least operate it for that period of time till they can get their power back. Interestingly enough, Great Neck actually has a provision that you can exceed their noise ordinance if you're using an electric generator, as long as your power is off, but as long as the reason your power is off has nothing to do with your non-payment of your bill. So I'm just saying that's Great Neck. So we'll leave it at that.
Cool with that.
That is a provision. That's the only place I saw that provision.
Interesting. I doubt it comes up that often.
But for example,
there.
in terms of Rhinebeck up in Dutchess requires that all generators are designed or equipped with noise dampening features, including but not limited to insulated housing or silencing mufflers, so that's actually written into their code to be there. That could also be, again, you don't have to necessarily put that in zoning. You can make that part of your noise ordinance, but you want to present this to you folks there. I think if you were to limit it to, let's say, between 45 and 60 minutes once a week, have a decibel limit that's somewhere within the range that these folks are talking about, I think that's consistent with what you're seeing in other places, and at least would allow the equipment to be operated as maintenance as required by the manufacturer's specs.
I'm sure that there are a number of questions that folks have, but I just want to ask procedurally. You're talking about two different approaches that we could take, one of which would be to amend our noise ordinance.
Correct.
And one of which would be to look at it from a zoning code
Correct.
change. I don't know if that's a text amendment to the zoning, because we've talked about how we may want to have sort of a comprehensive review of zoning issues, but right now this is coming to us as a particular need
Right.
that somebody's going to have, that somebody has, that they're anticipating already, that other people could as well, and we already have a gap in
Right.
our noise ordinance provision to allow for emergencies. So
You are correct. I'm presenting it in two different ways, and that's primarily because in other jurisdictions,
They do
they
it.
tie the two
correct.
together. But that's not universal. The Scarsdale is specific in their noise ordinance. That's they just have 70 decibels, and the distance in terms of measuring what that's to be. And they in fact put their setback requirements within their noise ordinance. They have it there. But we could the board could certainly go that route, which is to, in essence, sort of fill what is a gap that otherwise exists in the noise ordinance, and then at a later time, where there's a more comprehensive view, if it thinks it's appropriate, to include provisions with regard to that type of equipment, which is otherwise not referenced at all within the zoning code.
So I guess the one question I had is the town of Rhinebeck.
Yeah.
Is that section of. Sorry, thank you. That section of the ordinance is that part of zoning, or is that a noise ordinance?
Trustee comment. That's in their zoning code. That's one
in
of
the
their
zoning
That's a
code.
special requirement under their zoning code.
Okay. Is that element there anything that we can't make that part of the noise ordinance, right?
In terms of what you would want to equip it with, no, but
I mean, the noise
If in
dampening
fact-
features? The noise dampening features, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, I mean, listen, I think we have to change the noise ordinance to be like up to date and current and stuff like that, because I think that anybody who was around here for Sandy or any other recent natural events that have taken place where trees are falling and power is out, I mean, I remember being out of power for, a number of days. So, and truth be told, my neighbor had a generator, and, he was running basic equipment, and he ran that generator. He didn't run it 24/7, but, he ran it for significant periods during the day, and he probably would have been, out of compliance with our noise ordinance as it relates to that. So
was I.
okay. Okay, well, now everybody knows. But anyway, I'd like to see the noise ordinance become more relevant to the current time, and use the different provisions that you've kind of put together from other folks. I think it's interesting when you talk about the commercial property piece, which is you've got these generators that are obviously there to help that particular multi-apartment structure, and yet there are regulations on how close that generator can actually be to that building.
well, it's interesting in Mount Pleasant, which I quoted from, and that's also in their zoning regulations. Their section for emergency electrical generators for residential is only 3 short paragraphs, but emergency electrical generators for commercial is nearly a page and a half, and very specific. It talks about what the noise level has to be. It talks about how you have to run it, the fuel supply. It's very, but all part of the zoning code.
Right.
Because there's permits that would be required to basically site it at particular locations. And as I said, what Mount Pleasant in fact goes to is they actually require site plans in certain situations for that type of
It
apparatus.
seems that's reflective of what we're being presented with here, because a personal home, if they want to put in a generator, is not going to have nearly the noise imposition as something for a large apartment complex, like what Scarborough Manor is introducing, which is why it's like a couple paragraphs for a residential homeowner
Right.
versus a commercial property, which has a lot more.
You also,
demand.
I think, what you're seeing, and what I saw, is that you have it distinguished between a portable generator, which you may see much more in a residential,
Yes.
as well as a fixed generator, which you're going to see in certain locations. Now, you do have a lot of people who have fixed generators, but
In the village of Ossining?
not necessarily.
Homeowners? Not homeowners in the village of Ossining.
Not
a
within
lot.
the village,
No, okay.
down outside you.
Well, that's not our jurisdiction.
I understand. I'm just making a point from, those of us on the other side.
Talk to the third floor.
But there are a number of these where they do explicitly distinguish between portable versus the fixed, because in that, for example, portables don't require a permit. The fixed do require a permit because it's actually an accessory to the building. And obviously they need permits for the lines and everything that has to go in there. And that's why I think, in response to Trustee Cobbin, I think you're seeing much broader requirements for the commercial because they're much larger units. The units they propose to put in are fairly large. And it's interesting that currently the unit that they have is inside, but they've, I guess, determined because of size and need, they're going to actually move them outside. And that's why they came to us.
Well, I guess the only other thing I would ask is maybe the folks from SWA would be, willing to. Maybe the folks from SWA would be willing to do something with baffling, at least related to the placement of the, of this generator. I mean, we could ask them to do that. I mean,
We certainly can, and they've in fact indicated that they were going to put a lot, they were going to do what they could to in fact muffle the sound at that location, be it through vegetation or be it through some sound muffling information, because they're aware of what the noise is, and particularly since being a multi-family location, the way the noise ordinance is, it's the closest unit that's there, not the property line. So, this is obviously something that will affect the people who are within that building as well as homeowners that are in that area. So,
I assume it's both though, because they couldn't just put the sound baffling on the side that's closest to the unit.
No, it
unit
would
and make it unpleasant for the neighbors on the other side of the property line. So
it would have to go there, and I think that's certainly something that, the folks at the building department, because it will be a fixed structure, could discuss with them in terms of what they need to do that. I think that would be certainly a fair request to make of them.
did you have a question? You seem to be.
No, I used to live there. I mean, truthfully, they're more concerned about people living in those buildings. Sound travels up. It's actually going to affect the people living there who are going to complain. The two neighbors on the side are totally downhill from behind trees, actually. So, but we're not making changes for one unit, for this one person or this one company. We're thinking about all the other properties in the village. I like the commercial differentiation, actually, from the residential.
When it comes to the portable generators, I think that comes up when we're talking about we don't have any provision for emergency usage when we're out of power. So, like the putt-putt generator on my front porch that was enough to keep my refrigerator going and my phone charged was really loud for the amount of power that it gives off. And if anybody had complained, then I'm sure it was well beyond what the noise ordinance was.
There's at least one of the ordinances here, and I don't know if I have referenced it. It might have been New Rochelle, I'm not sure, had a provision that for the portable generators, they, as I said, if there is an emergency, they can operate essentially outside the noise ordinance. And they define emergency, for example, as a health emergency, a lack of power, and essentially you can operate it for up to the point where basically the emergency has concluded. So that gives a much greater leeway. And that particular ordinance, and again, I forget exactly which municipality, it was specific to that for portable. Did not, so that can certainly be put in there so that we can explain that.
I think that's actually more likely to be something
here.
that we should be addressing.
Sure.
It's more likely to be happening in our community than the large portable in anything other than a major development like Scarborough Manor.
The Great Neck provision, that was part of the code. That was part of zoning code.
That is their zoning code. But Trustee Cumming, in that one, it's in the zoning code, but they reference back to the noise ordinance. So that's where in their code they're talking in the zoning code in terms of what the generators must comply with the noise ordinance, and they refer you back to the noise ordinance, which basically talks about that it cannot operate, between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. or for more than 30 minutes in any 7-day period. So there's a cross-reference there.
I would be interested to know, and I'm not sure who the right person to ask is, if it's somebody who works in sound, if it's the police department, because they're the ones who deal with the sound complaints. But they do measure. At what point are people complaining? Because if we're going to put in a number, we know that from the manufacturer that this particular one says between 73 and 75 decibels. But if we were to include something along the lines of if it truly is something that's feasible to do the noise dampening provision to require that so that it is not above a certain threshold. I'd like that threshold to be relevant to the human experience, not just an arbitrary number. So I guess that would be my question. If the police could tell us, or if there's a best practice for what's an appropriate sound level for people to be able to tolerate and not be too much of an imposition on their quality of life.
No, we can try to find that out, and as I noted, the decibel limits are all over the place in terms of the other places. So you go from 60, up to 80, and so we can certainly do that. And if my recollection when I spoke with the engineer at Stephen Winter Associates was that when they do the testing, they essentially do it without any muffling on it. So it's just you're hearing, basically the raw noise that's coming off. So the question would be, given what kind of muffling you could put on, what would that drop it, down to? And that may give us a better idea as well as where we are in terms of coming up with a number.
Yeah, I'd like to know. Yeah, what is their capacity
Sure.
with the existing technology? But then I'd also like to know, because technology changes all the time, what's an appropriate level for people to tolerate, for us
Got
to
it.
incorporate as a standard.
Right. And again, I do want that. One of the reasons I wrote to them was to find out under their manufacturer's specs, how often do they say their equipment should be tested? But again, the ordinances that I came up with, no one's doing it more than once a week, and it's anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes or 30 and 60 minutes once a week.
But if you have two generators, then
Well, then the question is, do you operate them
piece
at
of
the same
equipment,
time, or do you do them?
but then isn't it super loud if they're both going?
Yeah. So then you're looking at potentially,
No,
you know,
decibels don't work like that. It's not.
it doesn't
This
double it.
plus this equals double.
Really?
Yeah, I
You don't think it would be any
I
louder?
don't think that it might be louder, but I don't think it's what you're implying.
It's not. It's not. It doesn't.
That's not
work
how
to a factor
sound
of two.
works. Yeah,
Understood.
But
sound waves
I'll
don't
find
work
out what
like that.
number
Yeah.
would be.
So online you can get, it's called a decibel chart, and it gives you relative
Yeah.
human interaction and what it is. So moderate rainfall is 50 decibels. Normal conversation is 60.
New
Busy
York,
traffic is
85.
70. Vacuum cleaner is 80. Shouted conversation is 90. A passing motorcycle at 2 meters is 100. So that kind of gives you a relative feel
For
what
decibels?
70 decibels would be.
Me yelling at my children is
So
90.
I can tell you,
No,
that
it's off the chart. baby.
according to this chart,
really my poor neighbors.
when you start getting to 70 decibels, you start getting into the, if it's prolonged rate and you're listening to it for a long period of time, you're starting to get into lost hearing abilities. So I think that's why you see a lot of the 60 and 70s,
Right.
not to exceed and no longer than 45 minutes, because otherwise you're affecting
5
people's
element.
hearing.
Interesting. Okay.
Because it affects the hair inside your eardrums. That is what
Right.
causes your deafness.
Right.
And so prolonged
So
use
it's a
is
really
what
great
causes
chart
that.
that you can get online, but that kind of gives you some relative feeling of what that means.
So that's why 70 is. I mean, it is sort of all over the place,
Like
but
busy traffic.
70
Seems
is
to be there.
yeah,
Okay.
it is sort of the reasonable level that we all tolerate on a regular basis. Okay. Stuart, do you feel like you have
I have
some
instructions.
sense of how to move forward with this as noise ordinance at this stage? And if we wanted to incorporate it in a more thorough manner
I
with
do.
zoning, that would be something to consider as we're doing a bigger.
I do.
zone.
Thanks.
And
Yes.
when do they need to know? What
They're-
are we telling them? Because
what
that's
I-
where it all started.
What I have told them is that it's a matter that's being considered by the board, that,
Okay.
now that they're going to be working on something to, as long as they know that it's moving in a direction that there would be something that would give them comfort so that they're not going to keep getting cited, they're continuing with the work. They're developing the plans. There's been nothing submitted to the building department, but they are going forward with that. And I, as I said earlier this week, sent some questions to the engineer to just get some more information, and I'll follow up.
Does it have to go to the planning department as well? Because if they're building a structure outside their typical building,
They would likely
Person.
need a permit for that. And then the planning board may well come in and, while they probably won't have a problem with a setback because we have no specific setback requirements, planning itself may come in and say you're gonna have to put certain sound dampening or things there so that it has that impact. So, if there's an ordinance with a number, then it gives the planning board guidance to say you're gonna have to come within that number, or otherwise, we can't do anything there.
So even if the ordinance is not passed, obviously you're in communication regularly with the planning board. So
Correct.
you can give them a sense of how we're moving forward.
Yes,
Because I wouldn't want this to be installed and then say, well, we installed it before the ordinance was in place, so we can just run it 7 days a week as long as
No,
we
they-
want. So
They've
I'm sure that's not the case. I
But-
just don't want there to be any confusion.
No,
But I think
they
it's
won't be.
nice that they called you first.
Right.
That's all. So I think there's good intent.
Thank you, sir.
Got it.
Before I move on, is this down, Jamie, because of
Maybe the.
not us? All right, I'm gonna. It's really annoying. I'm gonna put it
Really, I didn't even notice it till you said so.
You don't need it, right, Stuart? 'Cause we're just
I
talking
do
about
not.
stuff.
Yeah, I literally didn't notice that it was there.
Our lighting is completely shifted. Is that intentional? You want the lighting like this? Fine, you're happy
Yes,
with
I'm
it?
getting a headache.
Okay, there's nobody sitting out there. It's totally reversed, but it'll be interesting to see the lighting and it's in the dark, but nobody's here. So. Okay. Thank you, sir.
All right, so our next discussion
Now I'm
is
less
going to be regarding the village code and certificate of occupancies. And Stuart is also working on that project.
Thank you again, Debbie. Again, this is to the memo I sent around earlier, and I will give you folks copies. I know that there were prior discussions before my tenure relating to some additions to the code regarding certificates of occupancy, specifically at the point in time where a property changes hands to allow for what we might call an updated certificate of occupancy. There are 3 municipalities in the area that actually have that provision. And frankly, they're the only 3 that I was able to find, Peekskill, Sleepy Hollow, and Tarrytown. And what they effectively provide, and I'll read you from the Peekskill, is that occupancy or use after sale, a requirement for a certificate of occupancy, one of the bases for that would be occupancy or use after sale of any improved real property, including an individual condominium unit and an individual cooperative unit, which for the purposes of this section shall be considered a piece of improved real property. Upon sale or transfer of any such real property, an updated certificate of occupancy issued no earlier than 60 days before closing shall be required before the premises or unit may be used or occupied. It shall be the obligation of the seller to apply for and obtain the updated certificate of occupancy unless the parties agree otherwise in their contract of sale. The Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow's ordinances are effectively the same. The only difference in Tarrytown, the updated CO must be issued no earlier than 30 days before closing, and Sleepy Hollow is 60 days. As I also noted in my memo to you folks, the penalty provision in both Sleepy Hollow and Peekskill is fairly strict. If you're in violation of this, a first-time violation is no less than $5,000, no more than $10,000 for the first day, $1,000, no more than $5,000 for each and every day that the violation continues. As well, the party who is convicted of the violation is required to pay all costs and expenses that are incurred by the city, or in the case of Sleepy Hollow, the village, in determining the violation. What this would effectively do, particularly in terms of the CO, is that prior to a closing, the seller would have to apply to get this updated certificate of occupancy, which would initially involve an inspection by the building department to see that the location is up to code, and so that this updated certificate can be issued. You'll note when I read this that in these 3 jurisdictions, it effectively applies to all types of property, single units, single family, condos, co-ops, multifamily, commercial. They do not distinguish with regard to that. Clearly, if a violation was observed, that violation would have to be cured, and the heavy fines are presumably to deter anyone from essentially closing on a property and sort of doing it without the knowledge of the building department. This would allow the building department to undertake the inspection, particularly see if there are any illegal units that are within the particular building or location. One of the things that the village manager and I discussed is obviously one from a manpower perspective, because one of the things that I have asked our assessor to provide me with is the number of real property transactions that have occurred in 2015 and 2016 to sort of give us an idea, and he will be giving me that information broken down by property classification. So we'll have an idea of how many actually inspections we're talking about that might be required. Another thing I mentioned to the mayor, and I've also mentioned to the village manager, is we probably want to have a discussion about this with local realtors, because they're the ones who are going to be initially dealing with this, because they're the ones who are going to have to tell the seller, you have to go and get this done. Most sellers may not know about it, but it will become a requirement. One of the benefits is it will probably reduce substantially the number of FOIL requests that the building department gets, because instead of asking for all the old C of Os and permits, they're going to be getting one. So we're not going to, as Joe Augustinelli has said on many occasions, about 90% of all the FOILs that come into the village clerk's office are for the building department records. And just for you folks' knowledge, we're well over 500 FOIL requests as of this point in the year. So you can just do the math on that. So that's what we have again in those three jurisdictions: Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, and Peekskill. My preference would be that it be 30 days rather than 60, because one of the things is you don't generally know what your closing date is when you're 60 days out. You're not even necessarily sure that you're in a contract 60 days out. Some things go a little quicker, but that's that's just a matter of how this board wants to go. What this would involve would be a change to the housing code that we recently put in terms of section 162, which relates to the 162-32 dealing with certificates of occupancy. We also have in the zoning code section 270-44 that deals with when COs are to be issued. So we want to obviously have those in concert. But this would allow it. There are various things that would need to be considered. If there's going to be a fee for this for the application, how much is the fee going to be? How much time is going to be involved, obviously, in the inspection? If there is a violation, it's going to involve, obviously, the seller making those corrections, and then a reinspection from our end. And also simply how does the building department, get the knowledge that, in fact, there's going to be a closing on a place on a given day. All that notification becomes important, because one could certainly see a situation where a sale is done and no one tells the building department. And the only time we know is when the assessor gets, a list of the RP 527 from the county clerk that there has been a transfer of property. But those things, can be worked out. Peekskill and Tarrytown have had these ordinances for close to 10 years. Sleepy Hollows, I believe, is 3 years old, but they all follow that way. And that's that particular ordinance that I wanted to bring to your attention. I'll just go on very briefly. I did include here reference to another ordinance that the board may wish to consider, which deals with issues relating to presumptions in the event that presumptions to determine whether a house is in fact illegal, or the number of families in a particular location is illegal. Sleepy Hollow is again one of the locations that has this particular type of ordinance. It's particularly popular, I didn't realize, on Long Island. You see that many places have it, but effectively what it says is if you are prosecuting someone either civilly or criminally for a violation as to whether it's an illegal residence, you can go in with certain presumptions which are rebuttable. One would be, for example, if it's a detached dwelling that has more than one mail receptacle, more than one gas meter, more than one electric meter, and or more than one water meter, you can presume that it's the residence of 2 or more families. And then if it has more than 2 mail receptacles, then you can presume it's 3 or more families that are there. If you have a detached dwelling unit which has an entrance that is not on file and approved by the building department, you can presume that there are 2 or more families living in there. If there are 2 entrances that are not on file, you can presume that it's at least 3 families that are living in that house. A dwelling unit with 2 or more doorbells has the same number of families as the number of doorbells. Now that's not necessarily the case if you have a front and back door. I understand, particularly if they chime differently, as mine does. But this is something that is, as I said, it's seen in Sleepy Hollow. It is also seen very popularly out on Long Island, particularly on Long Island with single and 2-family homes. But what the presumption does is that if the prosecutor goes in and is making the case, he doesn't have to. It's in essence understood that because this is what is observed, then this is a house that houses more than X number of families. And it would be the obligation of the defendant to demonstrate that, no, I have that's not the case, or that my house is, legal for whatever reason.
And the manner for doing that would be?
What the code in Sleepy Hollow and the other codes provide is that the owner of the house who gets the citation can request an inspection by the building inspector to essentially come in and say, look, this is legal. This is fine. I don't have X number of families here. I may have an extra gas meter, but there's a reason for it, and I can explain it. That then defeats the presumption. Doesn't mean that you can't continue with the case, but it at least leads to the ability from the prosecution end to say that this particular location is not that this particular location has more families because of how the house appears from the outside. And as I said, that's you do see that a lot, particularly on the island for some reason. Again, it would then be up to the defendant to show, in fact, that the unit was legal. But it does provide another means of enforcement. And again, it's a presumption which can be defeated. It's not irrebuttable. Someone would have to come in and defeat it, but it does, assist in the prosecution of the cases.
These are 2 different potential
Yes.
proposals that we're talking about right
Correct.
now.
I just
and they are
wanted
2 of the 4 that you emailed to us before I was mayor, and we have brought up for discussion on a number of occasions.
Correct.
Landlord registry was on that list of 4 as well, and I don't remember what the 4th one was, but these were 2 of them we have discussed on
A
a
few
number
years
of
back.
occasions, and I believe they're both in place in Sleepy Hollow, correct?
These are both in Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah.
The 2 that I mentioned to you are in Sleepy Hollow.
And they have now a few years experience because they were in Sleepy Hollow when we talked about this before.
Yes.
So, have you talked to folks about this lately?
No, I haven't. But so let me start with the CEO portion of that.
Sure.
Yes, I've been waiting for that for a very long time, so I'm definitely 100% behind that.
Okay.
We do have, and that's what I was going over my phone, because we do have an application fee for a certificate of occupancy, and that is $50
Okay.
for building, and alterations is of alterations of $50,000. So, and then it's $100 for a building of $100,000, $150 and $200. So I couldn't find. I thought we had, and I'm pretty sure I've seen this before, but there should be an application for a certificate of occupancy in our website, because I thought we did have one, but I couldn't find one in the list on our website right now. But I remember seeing that certificate of occupancy application before.
Right.
So if you talk to Joe, please,
I will do that.
see if we can locate that.
Sure.
But that portion, I think we can kind of take care of that, and when we go into budget season, we can talk about the application fees and all the other
Sure.
stuff, and if that's the case. So to me, that part is a no-brainer. The other part, and if my recollection is sort of correct, maybe, when we talked about mailboxes, gas meters, electric meters in different locations, and even satellite dish being.
No, it's expressly not.
No, I know. But that was part of one of the conversations we had. You may want to take a look at the notes from our previous lawyer.
Okay.
It should be a whole file, I hope, because there were some questions in regards to what that means. I brought up definitely Sleepy Hollow because, um, you know, my house actually have 3 doorbells, and one
Well-
of them doesn't work. It's just one of them that is, it's one of the battery, that they have. So, things like that happen.
Yeah, I think the doorbell one
So-
is probably the least effective here, obviously. But, if you're looking at water meters or gas meters or things like that, clearly satellite dishes wouldn't work either.
Right.
But there are other ways, that you can look at that. I mean, it's,
I just want something that I don't want to waste our time, so to speak.
right.
Someone taking a court that we can use that time to utilize in a different manner.
Sure.
I'm definitely supporter of that, but I want to make sure whatever we pass is something that we can definitely support that. And I'm okay with that definitely. Like I said, that's something that I brought up a couple of years back, and I think that's something essential for what we've been trying to do in the past couple of years. So
Got it. Okay.
I'm good with that.
Questions or comments?
Actually, Stuart, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about, how do you know if there's like a cash buyer? Like, we have a lot of, particularly some of our larger buildings where people buy cash and you won't, they buy with cash and you won't know that they bought it until it comes time to register it with Fernando.
Right.
So how we like, what is
Well,
if you're not going through the traditional mechanism of buying a house, how would you know if someone bought the house?
Well, so you're saying in other words, if they did it completely outside and they didn't even file anything with the county clerk and there was no, because if,
Well, how would you had mentioned it? You had mentioned
because
yeah.
what would happen is if someone makes a purchase, deed gets filed, gets filed with the county clerk, it also gets filed with a document called an RP 527, which is the sale price.
Okay.
And that goes to the assessor's office. We get a copy here. In the situation you described, if it were to turn out that that individual had never reported the transaction, meaning the village did not have an opportunity to get in, if you go by what they have in Peekskill, he's looking at potentially $10,000 for the first day. And what happens is it's the new owner because it says it's the owner. It's not the guy who sold the house.
Yeah.
It's the owner. So, it's in the owner's interest, particularly since it says that it's the seller's responsibility to do it unless the contract has different. It's, if I'm buying, I'm going to say to him, just make sure this is done. I don't care how it's done. Just make sure it's done. We clearly don't know all places that are going for sale. I mean, I know I obviously get lists of houses that are on for foreclosure because the village gets named as a defendant in those cases. But, foreclosure is, even in a foreclosure case, there's going to be a sale at some point. But if it's just a one-on-one sale, we in the village aren't going to know, which is why it's important, I think, to let the brokers and other people know that this is now a requirement within the village. So that as part of your, Mr. Broker, due diligence to your seller, he's going to have to get this done. It's a checkoff box, something along those lines. I think would have to be done. But again, if they don't do it, and then we ultimately find out he's got the significant monetary fine for not doing it, and he wouldn't have anyone else to blame but himself.
With the presumptions, I'm a little leery of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't want people walking up to people's houses counting doorbells and stuff.
Well, I don't think that's what's being said here. I think what they're doing is they're revising the notion of what is it, how do you evaluate a C of O, right? I mean, isn't
It's
that
two
no,
different
it's
things.
two different things.
Two different things.
Like I think, while I understand what the purpose of the law is, of catching unscrupulous persons or landlords or trying to catch some of those dangerous situations, there's the other side where if you're not doing that, right, and then you're the average citizen, and then you're being dealt with, you're dealing with the building department now, and now you have to prove yourself to the
Guilty
building.
until proven
You know
innocent.
what I mean? That to me,
And I think that's the reason why I say, because there was it's a lot of questions in that we asked, this board asked a couple years back, and like I said, it should be
I'll
part
check.
of the file, because I don't want to misrepresent something that we can always go back to the I don't want to go back to those meetings, I come back to the tape, but there was questions in regards to that and constitutional.
Yeah,
Kinda
it just
stuff,
seems
so-
kind of.
Well, it's interesting because one of the municipalities on the island has a provision that essentially well, the town of North Hempstead, in their opening paragraph, says that, what we're doing here has already passed constitutional muster, which leads one to believe that there may well have been a case. It's
Yeah.
interesting they put that in, that did that. But they also have a provision later on that says that, in fact, if any one of these requirements is stricken, that doesn't strike the entire ordinance. So, but I'll be happy to go back and look at what we did before.
I share your concerns as someone who has 2 doorbells, and some people in the world don't really like me. I can see myself having to open up my door to prove that I am one family living in my zone for one family home, and that's really disconcerting to me. So, like, I always try to put myself in somebody else's shoes, and this time I couldn't avoid being in somebody else's shoes, and it was really made me uncomfortable. That said, both of these provisions, we're not, cooking them up. And the reason that Manny suggested them and that they keep coming up as things to consider is our frustration with being able to effectively deal with overcrowded housing and having more mechanisms to be able to get into homes and to be able to question properties where we just have, it's kind of notorious that we can't get into these homes, especially if they're a 2-family home. So we don't have the annual or triannual fire inspections. So there's a really good motivation for doing it. So I'm most interested in hearing if there's a number of communities that have provisions like this, what has their experience been? I'd like to know from their building department, any their courts, any case law. Like, I'd really like to know what we're considering here.
I'm happy to
it's
follow.
tested.
I'm happy to follow up both with their prosecutors and with their building department to see exactly what they've done and where it's been. I know that there was, when this board looked at the Peekskill ordinance before, my predecessor had spoken with the building folks in Peekskill, who initially there was a concern that it would be, they'd be, overwhelmed, but they actually found that it worked very smoothly. And in fact, it was something that the realtors at the end of the day liked because it provided, it was definite. They knew that your house is legal, so there's no issue with regard to that. But particularly with regard to these presumptions, that is something I'll follow up with, some of those other municipalities to see, what the experience has been. Because, and let me just make the point, in a lot of these cases, you're going to have property owners who may not be represented by counsel, so, they're not going to know the difference between a rebuttable presumption and an irrebuttable presumption. And, and what do they have to do to prove that, in fact, this is what it is. But,
Well, but
I'll check with
there's
them.
a couple things there. Number one, I think we live under a mistake that houses are private. And apartments are private. We live in a social environment. Google has people running all over the planet with cameras taking pictures of our houses and our backyards. So what goes on inside your house, I'd actually dislike that more, that people come into my house and inspect based on ideas. Outside, 2 doorbells, 3 mailboxes are totally visible, really, unless you're living off the grid, which is not what this village is like. It's pretty public. I mean, you drive by, you see it. So it's, I think the presumption actually is pretty fair. Whether you can argue it or not is a matter of communications. You can give everybody a form that says, this is what we believe. By the way, this is how you can argue with us. Here is the process for you to say that we're wrong about this. Here's a lawyer's name. Here is whatever it is, I don't believe that these rules and policies are gotchas, right? I mean, that's not what the intent here is. We have, and all these villages and towns have situations that we've been trying to deal with for years. This is more or less, I think, less intrusive than some of the others. And frankly, telling people how they could fight it shouldn't be a secret. Because if, in fact, there's a legitimate reason why you have 3 mailboxes in a 1-family home, we should know that, and we should never go beyond you writing us a letter. If that's all that's necessary, here's why. Whatever it is that they can do, I think we have an obligation to help people. I'm not interested in, catching innocent people. I'm interested in educating people and saying, and I'm interested, by the way, I would add lawyers, local lawyers, so realtors, local lawyers, and local accountants, and frankly, even the banks, and educate and say, this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, and tell people this is how you fight it, even more so if you believe that we have homeowners who may not be in a position to afford a lawyer, or even more so, it's simply communications. I hate the "you're not allowed to do this" concept. I think I'm very happy to tell people how to fight it and say, here's what you can do, and do it. And we should make it difficult. I mean, so if you have 2 doorbells, we should tell you that it's simply a letter, explain it, and whatever. I mean, I don't know what the rule is, but you need to help us with that.
That will be part of what you will
Yeah,
be learning when you're reaching out
exactly.
to these other communities.
will.
How do they address it? Because I'm sure they don't want to make miserable living conditions for all of their
No.
residents either.
I will take
Or
my
fill up their
doorbell
courthouses.
Kidding. Get rid of the trick-or-treaters on the back door, too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of feel like the C of O consideration is pretty clear. I don't think anybody here has
I
any
thought we
objection
were
to
pretty, we've talked about it before, yeah.
We have, but I'm pleased that you're going to be reaching out to some of the realtors and also getting the information on how many properties we're talking about, because
Yeah, I'll
if
have
we're
that.
talking about,
Okay.
500
Okay.
houses, single-family homes that are sold each year that now have to be inspected by our building department, where we're understaffed right now, and we may never want to be staffed to the point where all of that's going to happen. What's the cost benefit? So, I mean, I think there's still some considerations on how to move forward, but philosophically, I'm getting the sense that people
That's fine.
are
I'll-
interested in
I'll-
figuring
Good.
it out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'll have those counts
That's a good
tomorrow,
point.
as a matter of fact.
Sorry.
But what was the other part? You said the first part is easy. What's the second one? John?
What's that?
You said the first part we get, but what's the second one? But then you never finished because.
Oh, well, I was just saying that, I mean, I guess we're looking at these things in combination. They seem to be different pieces of
I
legislation.
just wanted to present them to you, but they can absolutely be split.
Separate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think,
totally separate.
I'm just saying that they're different things, and I
Correct.
think we all like the C of O thing. It looks like we want to get more information, data, so we understand how
Right,
many
yeah,
inspections
yeah.
what might be
That's
based on
fine.
sales that are currently going on historically, and kind of what that means for
mhm.
that. And I mean, I'm glad that we all got to this place, and thank you, Stuart, for your work in putting all this together and bringing us, what we need to move forward. This is a very important piece of legislation because I believe it draws the line. And we say from this date forward, any transactions that are happening in the village, we're going to have a chance to, and basically what happens is over time, we're going to have inspections on many of the properties for years to come that are very close in time to each other. And I think that's only going to provide a better view into safe housing and housing that's also, in proper condition and certified for occupancy and safety of the people living there.
Deputy Mayor Codman, thank you for bringing it back to that, because that was really where this all came from. And Trustee Quesada, this must be somewhat rewarding to you because you've been pushing for us to consider these for years now. And so, Mr. Kahan, thank you very much for bringing it to this point. This board has taken a really strong position on wanting to address safe housing, and these are some really definitive measures to give to enable our building department to be more effective in addressing this big picture goal of safe housing and specifically overcrowded housing. So thank you for getting us to this point. I look forward to seeing what information we get from the assessor's office and from the real estate folks and all the rest of the research you're going to do, and then come to us with a proposal for that we can hopefully support
Got it.
forward.
Certainly.
Thanks.
All right, moving on to the next discussion is landlord-tenant relations, and Stuart is on for this, but I think, Rika, you also participated in this. Is
And
this
Trustee
And
Basemore as well.
Contal.
What I've
We're both on the subject.
what I've given to you folks is sort of a markup of the changes to Chapter 24, which is the Landlord-Tenant Relations Council. It increases, as we discussed, the membership to 9 members, and certain things with regard to appointments, who those members could be. There are provisions in here with regard to hearings and the ability to subpoena witnesses, as well as for rules of procedure to be followed by the LTRC. But this is to get this, moving forward. And so there are, that's what we have in here. And if that's, I just wanted to put this in front of you, and just so people know, what's underlined would be added. Obviously, what's in brackets would be deleted. But this is sort of the thoughts based upon what was discussed at the prior meetings.
So, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I am done.
So in 24-3, this is why I could not be a lawyer, because I'm not sure I'm correct in saying this, but about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line down, the 7th shall be impartial appointee. You're
Well,
taking
that's
that
coming.
out.
That's coming out, right?
All right, so
other
that
words-
comes out, and we're going with 3 shall be neither landlords nor residents of village. I have examples of, examples
Residents?
include. I'm
But
sorry?
that's, I didn't mean, no. 3 of such members shall represent landlord interests, 3 shall represent tenant interests, and 3 shall neither be landlords, I didn't mean to, it shouldn't be, neither landlords nor tenants in the village of Austin,
Okay,
is
that
what
makes
that
more
should say.
sense.
I apologize.
Okay.
That's what that should say. So that would be sort of our 3, wild cards, if you want to call it.
Okay. And then you've got the section 8, an attorney,
Right.
non-voting. Okay. Subpoena piece. So the thing that I just didn't know about
Right.
was the last section. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I wasn't aware about this 30-day thing. I don't remember ever seeing it before. Or
We have that actually with the Code Board of Appeals, and it's with 1 or 2 other boards.
okay,
It's hardly a requirement. In other words,
what is the intent of it? I think is what I'm
basically that to let them come up with their procedures, and
Okay.
that unless there is something that's really egregious, essentially that's their procedures are their procedures, and they can promulgate those procedures. This board would could approve it if they want to, or could essentially do nothing, and they just simply become the procedures of the landlord-tenant
trying.
relations.
All right, so the council adds a procedure of whatever sort. What you're saying is they're supposed to present it to the board. How do we start the 30-day clock?
Uh,
Like that's what I didn't get. Like what?
okay.
Or are there certain things that they could that? I mean, I sit on other boards. We don't submit. If somebody changed, like I don't know what qualifies as a procedure that you then give to the board. So the board now has 30 days. Like it's
The-
actually confused me that
Okay,
addition.
the thought would be that they would come up with a set of procedures.
Okay.
They would, and they could, frankly, electronically just submit it by me
Sure.
to the board. The board could look at it, discuss in a work session, and say these seem fine. We have no
Okay.
problem with that. Or this we're not thrilled with this one, and we're not we'd like you to modify that. But that was sort of the sense, which is that while it is a board-appointed committee and they are going to have certain significant responsibilities, at the same time, we want the procedures to be fairly consistent. And if it's something that this board thinks is just really is not where this board should, where this council should go, you would have the ability to, change their procedures, or at least modify or reject that particular procedure. My expectation is that the likelihood is that you're going to see the procedures and say if that's really what they want to do, that's okay. But we can refine that. And again, I did that because it is the situation with the Code Board of Appeals, and I think there's at least one other board where that comes from, where the board has the ability, the Board of Trustees has the ability to essentially say, approve, reject, or just
Okay.
pocket approve.
It's a check and balance.
Yeah, I just never saw it before, so.
So this
Okay.
is essentially moving forward the first 2 of I think the 5 recommendations that your subcommittee had, which is specifically related to getting the Landlord-Tenant Relations Council populated again so that they could start moving forward.
That would be
there were
correct.
additional
And the subpoena
recommendations
power.
that were made,
Right.
but this is the first 2 of your
Right.
list. Is that correct?
I actually have no comment.
Everything's been said.
Okay, so, well, it's sort of like next steps. I mean,
Well,
what is it that,
The next step for this
Yeah.
would be to call for a public hearing.
okay,
That can be a resolution on for the board next week. Public hearing then would be in 2 weeks after that, so that would be on the 18th to actually consider have a public hearing with regard to these changes, and then vote on it on the 28th of October.
when can we advertise the positions that we want to fill them?
I think you frankly should start as soon as you want. I
Okay,
don't think you have to
so
wait.
I'd like that to be the case. What, I guess that would be, who's publicizing, village management, or how does this work?
Yeah, I think it's
Okay,
through
so what do we need to do? We need to fill the positions, and I think you have a couple names, I have a name, like, who do they contact?
In fact, I was at the planning board meeting last night, and Michael Beldotti says that he has landlord representatives who he's going to be submitting names for.
Okay,
so
so
they're all
who's
gonna
the
be-
contact person? Because
As with all of our boards, they should go to the village website or click on the little hand raised icon, and it tells folks how they can email the village manager's office. It's jhoffman@villageofaustinge.org. Either send a resume or a letter of interest, and then from there, Jamie will contact us so we can schedule the interview. The question is, typically I attend the interviews with the liaison for the committee, unless the liaison's not able to attend or for some reason somebody else should sit in. So it sounds like we have a lot of interviews that we're going to be doing in the coming
well,
weeks.
that's good because there's two of us, and so you could do it with Quantel or with me or whatever. So that
Yes.
actually opens that up to more opportunities. But I'd like it publicized and not just on the website, which is just a curated, site. It's not really a great way to advertise for positions. So how can you help us with that?
So Jamie does all that, and I would ask her to just chime in and let you
You
know
want to
what
throw
she's
something in the
doing.
Gazette?
I'm sorry.
I said, do you want something to go in the Gazette? Like,
We could very easily do
It's
a letter
very-
to the
it's like-
editor in the Gazette. Why don't one of you write a letter to the editor in the Gazette? We've been as part of the
Why don't we do
subcommittee.
it together for both
Perfect.
of us, right? And we'll put something that can help us with that. But you were going to say something, so I see you pressing the button.
I was just going to say that we can send out a constant contact to our 2,000 plus contacts and not just advertise this board, but all of the boards where we have vacancies, which is all listed on the landing page for boards and commissions right now.
Okay. I mean, that's a fair thing. It's just that this is new. Also, there are people that are technically on it, and so we have
Well, their
to.
terms have expired, so we should be
I know they
reaching out
have,
to them.
but
We
we
should
need
be
to
reaching
reach
out to
out.
them again and saying we're reconstituting it. We're making a few modifications. We'd like you to come in. We'd like to. I mean, it's not even just interviewing; it's having a conversation again. Like you're really going to be doing stuff now, whereas it's been pretty dormant for years now. So
Right. That's why, I'm concerned that it gets put in with all the others.
Well, we can do it special.
Just because it's sort of been changed. It's new. It's
So
all
that's the
things that you
story.
said.
This is the Landlord-Tenant Relations Council where they were going through modifications right now. That's the lead. And then at the end, you can say, if you're interested in learning about any of the boards and
Right.
councils, there are a number of vacancies and expired terms. Please go to this link and learn more about all of them. But you don't have to list the rest of them. That sounds like what we're all saying?
Let me just bring one
But,
thing.
I just
Go
want to
ahead,
add
please.
something to that. On the others, you're able to say what they do and what, but it sounds to me like we can't. Can we put these items that discussed tonight, or we have to wait for 4 weeks?
Well, no, I would.
So how does that
If
work?
I may, trustee, I would say certainly the powers and duties that are listed in 24-2, that's not being changed. So
Right,
there's no
that's
reason
correct.
that cannot be
Linked.
part of
Good.
it without.
Good.
The one thing I wanted to just and really get a sense from the board here, the ordinance as now constituted, particularly, and I'm talking about 24-4, has the provision that the council may appoint such clerks and other employees as it may
Right.
from time to time require with the approval of the Board of Trustees. The expense of the council shall not exceed the appropriation that's made by the Board of Trustees. I just want to make sure that the board is okay with that being there. I mean, one of the things I know that was talked about is potentially training for these folks in terms of, mediation training and things like that, which may be an expense, but this gives them the ability to, appoint people who might, they may need as, assistance or things like that. So I just want to
I
make
assume
sure
there's
that that's-
$0 in any
Yeah, I don't
recent
think we-
budgets for this, so now we're talking about creating a budget line.
For 2000.
that's correct.
Then I mean, then as part of the budget process, we'll have an understanding of what would be a reasonable anticipated budget for training or support
Yeah, we can do
services.
some research on
Yeah.
all what training would be.
That's
We're in
fine.
September, so
It's the time to figure it out. Perfect.
yeah,
Okay.
we'll tell people. you know, that we're not going to promise so much because we have to be able to deliver on it.
Right.
So the timeline is we're going to call for a hearing next week on the 4th. The hearing will be on the 18th,
Right.
and we could just pass it immediately, or we could wait 2 weeks until November
I'll wait
1st to pass it.
Probably wait the 2 weeks. So you wait till,
I agree with everything that is here. I think it's just more like how do we get to that, to get the people involved and have all the stuff that is the essential part.
And then, oh, sorry. And, you know, there were 5 recommendations, so
Yeah.
we were all good on 2. Some of us were good with the 3rd, some weren't. The 4th and the 5th were long shots, so we have to figure out the next steps.
So
there,
leases
too.
will be the next step, right? Discussing leases.
Yeah, I mean,
had
we have to
leases, there
figure
was-
out how to do that.
Registry was another issue
Yeah.
that had come up. That's right. So that's the next step, because as we broke it down, but at least these 2 are covered here, and then that would be, you know, whatever is next on that list.
But it's not what's being discussed in the public hearing yet because we have not.
Right.
But the public hearing is just the updates to
These
the
2.
Atlanta Tenant
Well,
Relations
there's
Council.
5 big recommendations, so the good thing is we got 2 done. Now we got to go to the next.
So my question is, that came out before I came on. Are the other 3 items something that this council, once appointed, could tackle?
No,
No, they're legislative.
legislative.
I mean, for a recommendation.
Oh, for
They
recommendation.
could certainly.
they
They
could-
could
Anybody can recommend. They don't even have to be on the
Yeah, but
council.
it's already-
The board and say, you know, we've been looking at this. I mean, I'm not sure what those.
as another level of
Oh.
investigation and
Right.
input, absolutely. But we don't necessarily need to
Or
wait
I have
for
made
the
a
board
copy.
to be,
Has
the
a
council,
Okay.
but we don't necessarily need to wait for the council to be constituted because there's a number of weeks of interviewing and then appointing and then the meeting. And I don't think that if Stuart and we are ready to move forward on considering something, then I wouldn't also want to wait for the Landlord Tenant Relations Council necessarily to.
We've already
I
kind
just
of,
didn't know.
yeah.
Okay.
So we've already made recommendations. So, like, we did our due diligence with the existing landlord tenant council. So there are certain things that we should be moving along, regardless of who sits in these chairs or not. Because if they have to sit in the same chairs and then come back and say the same thing that we've talked to at length about, it just doesn't make sense. So I guess my next question is, when are we discussing leases?
Well, next up was actually, and we were waiting for you. Stuart has the 5 recommendations, and they're actually in some sort of an order.
Okay.
We were going to bring the vendors because the village manager has not had the opportunity to meet because it involves costs and building department relationship. And I believe that was supposed to be the next step. I don't remember if it was supposed to be just village manager and any other trustee, but I remember that
It
specifically.
was the vendor that we were talking about.
Vendor.
Right, okay,
yeah.
so we talked about this the week before you started coming to the meeting. So
Literally.
anybody at home who would like to review the previous discussion, it starts somewhere midway, I think an hour and 20
I was
minutes
gonna say,
through.
120,
Yeah, because
Good.
I've linked it many times to people who have
August,
asked
okay.
about it.
Right.
At the October 23rd meeting, and so it sounds like what you're
August
saying is,
23rd. August
thank
23rd.
you, thank you.
Not
Um,
October yet.
the August 23rd meeting, and so maybe Debbie can meet with the subcommittee, which she's surrounded by, and
Two of
Rika.
us.
So it's
Yep.
and Stuart, and
Okay.
you guys can come back to us then with that next.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. So
Housing all the time.
we're going to give Stuart a break. We're going to ask Paul to come up and talk to us about snow and ice agreement. Great.
Snow and ice. It's 88 degrees out there, Paul.
Gotta get out ahead of this. Farmer's Almanac says we're gonna have a big winter, so
Yeah.
better make sure all our supplies
Really?
are.
Because I just came from the water heat up 2 degrees.
Yes, very causes extreme weather patterns as we have seen in the world coming to an
Hello,
end.
Paul.
Good evening, Mayor and trustees. Thank you, Manager McDonald. Next week, we have asked, as we do annually, to include the execution of the snow and ice agreement by the manager after the approval of the resolution by the Board of Trustees. But we want to take this opportunity tonight to present some information on that agreement, which is just a reoccurring contract that we execute with the State Department of Transportation, but it's a good opportunity to discuss some of the details of where that money comes from and why it comes to us. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank David Stone, head of the DPW office for some of the tribal and archive knowledge he provided me today to make this quick presentation. Back in '94, the state DOT approached communities that have state roads in their boundaries, which we do, including State Route 9, State Route 134, and State Route 133, also known as Croton Avenue, Pleasantville Road, and Camp Woods, part of Camp Woods Road, where 133 comes out over there. So, I'm sorry.
9A, right?
I'm sorry, I meant to say Upper Croton Avenue from Camp Woods to the village limit. Sorry about that. Anyway, the state has us calculated at about 14 lane miles. So even though those roads don't encompass 14 miles as a linear distance, we do get extra credit because some of them have parking, so that counts as another lane, and some of them are a little wider than the minimum, so that counts as additional lanes. So we're calculated at having 15 lane miles, if you will, that we maintain on behalf of the state for strictly snow and ice removal and treatment during the winter months, and hopefully that is a couple of months off, even though I think Trustee Levin might have just jinxed us, but we'll see. We'll see, because I do remember a pretty significant storm on Halloween a couple of years back, if everybody remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
So again, 1994 is when the states approached the munis with this, and the village at that time took the option of taking an index lump sum option versus a calculated lump sum where you have to document every single time you go on a state road. Now these roads are all kind of integral, and all our roads are tributary to them, so it's really almost an impossible task to figure out when you're plowing, when you're not plowing, because they all come out at the same time. And one of the questions that came forth was, what's the true cost? Is this getting offset by the money that the state's giving us? And how do we know that? So costs can be really thought of in a lot of different ways there on snow treatment. If you really get into the minutiae and you say, well, the vehicles and the equipment that we use to maintain the state roads, some of that have, there's a cost for the debt service for some of those vehicles. There's the chemicals that you load onto these vehicles to maybe do the pre-treatment that we do now, and then the treatment during and after with the abrasives and the salt that we buy from the State Office of General Services. But just because they're on Highland Avenue at one point doesn't mean that spreader doesn't keep turning and it turns off onto Aqueduct, for example. It's really I don't want to say an impossible task, but a cumbersome task. So taking away from the administrative burden in our office and putting the onus on the state to give us that index lump sum, we started doing that. In 1999, they reimbursed us for about $5,300, which at the time was probably significant if you look at the offsetting the cost of the real cost in our operating budget every year, which is the cost of salt and snow overtime and the vehicle fuel. In 2016 and 17, we received $23,500 and change from the state. And in 2017, 2018, we're going to receive right now contractually $24,600 if this gets executed per year. The other thing that the state does to help offset when you have a significant winter that has a lot of snow or a lot of ice or a lot of cold conditions that cause us to go out there with the vehicles and either remove snow or treat the roads to prevent an icing condition, is they give you this, they call it a J factor. I don't know what the J stands for. David didn't either, so therefore we're not going to tell you tonight, but maybe I'll try to find out by the public meeting. Legislative meeting. But anyway, it's really it's an upscale factor to offset those significant increases in a number of things, either labor, material costs, which they know because we buy the salt from the same supplier that the state does out of the Office of General Services. That's a pre-bid number every year with a vendor in the Northeast, so they get the same salt that we get, and also equipment costs. So our index lump sum factor is broken up. The option that we chose back in '94 and continue to use here, it's a 50% labor, 22% material, and 28% equipment factor. So the state calculates their rate on how much it costs them to maintain a lane mile using all those factors, and they give us that, and they uptick it based on the that J factor that I referenced earlier, and they adjust it at the end of the year, and they true up, if you will. So the 23,534 that they gave us for 2016 is going to be supplemented with an additional 11,696 for those uptick factors. So for 2016 and 17, we will get 23 plus 11. So we'll get roughly $35,000 to maintain those sections of Route 9, Route 133, and Route 134 in the state. Which, if just to give some rough numbers out of the operating budget, typical snow overtime for the entire year for any snow event out of the highway department is typically less than $30,000 per year in total. And the abrasives varies. Sometimes you can spend over $100,000, which we did a couple years ago when we had that extreme. We dropped into a deep freeze, and like it felt like September, and we didn't come out of it until March. It felt, and we spent over $125,000 in salt. This year, we have not even spent our minimum required to be purchased by OGS. We're going to have to purchase salt in advance and have it stored up with a vendor, which is an option to do because we can't take it all down here because we only have 600 tons of storage capacity up at the Armory. But we haven't even spent over $60,000 yet out of a $125,000 budget, I think. So we're way below there, and you'll see that when we go over the operating budgets and we do our budget reviews. You'll see that, you know, that hopeful savings that we have going in, you know, to the end of the year, because typically storm events are a January, February expenditure. So that's the details of the resolution, and that will be on next week for your consideration. And I appreciate the time. Are there any questions relative to what I said?
Well, while you're here, and we're talking about snow and ice, you mentioned you were very specific when you explained what the state roads are, and that we do the maintenance exclusively of snow and ice. You've given various paving updates. Paving is one of the things that people are most interested in learning about. We recently had some paving done on portions of Croton Avenue. Could you remind folks about that process? You said we only maintain the state roads for snow and ice.
Yeah.
That paving job was?
Okay. So unless you're driving with blinders and really good shocks, you can't help but notice that Con Ed's been in the village all summer long working on their utilities. Some of the main work they did was on Croton Avenue, and that's State Route 133, and that is mostly restored. They're still doing Upper Croton Avenue. They still have a lot of work that is yet to be done, but that work at the Pleasantville Road intersection out towards the town was the restoration work for Con Ed was overseen by the state. The restoration work from Pleasantville Road down towards the village, even though it's a state road, the state kind of deferred to us to oversee it, but it was still a state road. And we watched the restoration there. All of that restoration work was done and paid for by Con Ed subcontractors. So there's kind of like a gray line on when they want to. I haven't even pinned it down myself yet on when the state wants to come in and dictate what gets done, and sometimes they just defer to the munis and say, well, you can look at that. That's a utility that was done in your village. But at the end of the day, it's still a state road, and that's part of the lane miles calculation we get for snow and ice. And if we want to work there, we do tell the state if we want to do work there. And people that come in to that road need to get a state road opening permit from the state to make a connection for a utility if they're doing something on their private parcel that fronts 133, 134, or Highland Avenue.
What do you know anything about Ryder? I guess Campwoods too, but it's Ryder. They worked all weekend and stuff.
They're there as well. Now, just to do a quick recap, really maybe for Manager McDonald's benefit, a few months back when we were going into this paving season, that was Campwoods and Ryder were two of the roads, and Pugsley, which is off of Campwoods. That was three of the roads that we were going to pave. And we asked for permission to pave them last year from Con Ed. Not so much permission, but we asked for a heads up if they were going to do any work there. They want to know where you're going to pave so they can go get any work out of the way, and there was no work to be done. So when we called into Code 53, which is a state requirement for underground utilities before you do any work, Con Ed came back and said, well, what are you doing there? We're going to do gas work there. So I guess they updated their records. And you know what? At the end of the day, even though it was a little frustrating, I'm glad they did it and told us then versus what happened on Eastern Avenue where they said we don't have any gas work there. And then 2 weeks after we were finished paving it, they were putting in new services going up the hill. So that's a little frustrating. And I don't really like when that happens because that does compromise the job. And at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do other than ask for an appropriately constructed restoration on your new paving. So, and they did do that on Eastern, and it looks okay, but still, it's, you know, when the OCD kicks in, it's a little frustrating.
So what about Ryder? Do you know when they'll be done, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay.
They said they're going to work on it through this year. You know, as long as they can work in the road. I don't really anticipate any restoration work happening until the spring at best. I mean, they're well up past Maryknoll now.
No, they're not.
Brookside, I meant. Brookside School. They went up past Brookside.
Yeah, but they're not done where they are. And then Camp Woods, because you were going to do milling, hasn't been done because you were waiting for them.
Right. We're not going to touch that. I'm saying they've extended all the way into the town, and they're all the way, and they don't really know how far they're coming into Camp Woods either. They might come in and they might go down Pugsley. So I'm waiting to see, and then when I know they're done, we will talk to them about either reimbursing or doing the restoration themselves.
So I would just like letters going to that area. It's not just because I live up the way. I leave in the morning, I go to work, but all of the school buses that are going up, people are thinking it's probably another month. They really were working all weekend. I got to tell you, there were like 8 people full. I mean, they were really buzzing around, but there should be some notification that, you know, once winter comes, can't really do anything. The road is awful. I mean, it's bad, and all those school buses and those kids are standing on the side. It's bicycle. It's awful, and it's hilly and all. It's like our whole village. So if somebody could send, you could find out, I guess, the home and just let people know. I mean, I'm sure they're not all listening to this conversation,
Yeah.
all whatever, and let them know that it's probably looking like after spring.
Yeah, and up the hill from
Honestly,
the Route 9 bridge up
yeah.
the hill is county maintained road. Actually, Westchester County maintains that, and I've reached out to their commissioner of public works and made him aware that Con Ed was
Right.
digging in their road there, and that's going to be for them to oversee the restoration.
Which means all the water flow is going to be all screwed up because it's this whole thing with the water and going on to Route 9A underneath it. I mean, we just need to let people know because I've had people, they know I was going to be here today. I thought it was the same person, same name over and over again, but it's different people with the same first name. And I just started laughing, but nobody's upset to the extent that it's going to get fixed and repaved. But I think 6 months is different. I thought it was going to be a month or two, but I was wrong. My information was totally off. So sorry about that. But if somebody can reach out, I think that's just good communications with the community and let them know. That's it.
I'll work with the manager for that. On a more positive note, we have began the restoration on Snowden finally.
Oh,
And you know, a good thing for the residents along the Snowden Avenue corridor, and then some of the people that are beneficiaries of the improved utility on the waterfront. Snowden now has a new 12-inch water main that was put in as part of the Harbor Square project site plan approval. So that's good for water quality and quantity. Right, the pressure would be the same because of the hydraulics, but at the end of the day, they'll be able to get more flow, fire flow down there for future development, and the quality will be better because it's a brand new water main. Secondly, we have Con Ed came through and put a new gas main and all new services for all the residents on Snowden, and we did some drainage work while this was all going on too. So the road was pretty well torn up for the last 2 years, but you know, we don't anticipate having to do that for now for a very long time because they have a very intact utilities under that road, and we milled it yesterday and today. Tomorrow we'll hopefully be putting a leveling course on their binder, and then if weather permits, Friday and then maybe into next week we'll put the top course on, and then once that all settles and cools, within a week or two, we'll have all the markings back on the road, like the stop bars and the crosswalks and what have you.
So
At that,
do you mention that in your mayor's note about Stone and the work being done? I don't remember reading that.
I will next week because I'll have really cool photos.
Okay. No, because
Because it's actually getting paved at the end of this week. Right now, it's it's milling, which isn't as pretty and exciting.
no.
It's further destruction. Important for
and
the
then
drainage. But
so concurrent with that work that's going on now, we have the in-house crews are doing a lot of the curb and drainage repairs on Lower Linden, Glen Street, Croton Street, and Waller Avenue. You'll see some of that work going on now. That'll be going on until next week, and have the roads fully prepped for the contractor to come in the following week and start doing milling and paving on those roads. That money is through a couple of streams. One, Snowden Avenue is primarily being funded out of the water fund because the water main was a big reason that most of that got dug up. So not all of it, but most of it is going to get paid from an existing PO from, if you remember, from last year when we thought the Con Ed was going to be done. Is going to fund that. The balance of the money for that and the paving I just discussed on those 4 additional roads is through last year's and rolled over into this year's CHIPS money. Right now the PO, some of it pulled in your, because the board's been doing that annual contribution now, which we started last year of the $250,000 to supplement the CHIPS money, which is about $135,000. So it comes out to roughly $380,000, I think. So the PO is roughly for about $380,000. It might be a little under that. It might be a little over that, because at the end of the day, the contractor gets paid based on the tonnage they put down based on our annual bid contract. That's what they bid. They bid a per ton price.
So to just clarify what you just said, paving is paid for out of actually 3 sources that you referenced, which is CHIPS fund, water fund when appropriate if there was significant water work that was done, and the general fund because we've been putting money aside each year, or dedicating part of the general fund each year.
Yeah, our
Yes.
capital project.
But all predicted and all on budget, ahead of budget. Better
Yeah,
than budget.
I mean everything's budgeted.
Right.
I don't anticipate having to come back and ask for an additional borrow or an additional transfer of operating funds to do this.
Right. Does anybody mind if we have an executive session we're going to go to? So I don't want to have this go too long, but while we are discussing this and before our first snowstorm, and if we, prepare for the snowstorm, then maybe it won't come for a very long time. We sometimes call for a snow emergency, and the police chief just walked in, so if he wants to chime in. Calling a snow emergency in the village means that there are certain streets that cannot be parked on at a particular time. That decision is we try to make as well in advance as possible when we're really sure it's going to happen, because it is an inconvenience. It's a short-term inconvenience for people who normally park on the street and it's the streets that are snow emergency streets are the main thoroughfares primarily for safety reasons, so that emergency vehicles can get through and can stay clear and can be fully plowed by Public Works. And in different years, we've approached it in different ways. We've been a little more proactive in recent years, and so I just kind of want to, we've had various conversations over people actually taking note. If they live on a snow emergency street, if you park on a snow emergency street, there
John?
Because the same sign could be on your street for years and years, and you don't notice it until you get a ticket because you actually live on a snow emergency street, and so you need to. But the upside to that short-term inconvenience leading up to a storm of getting your car off of the snow emergency streets is that street can be cleared, curb to curb, and because you were referencing previous years where we got a snowstorm in late October, and that snow was still on the ground in March because we just kept getting snowstorm after snowstorm after snowstorm, never fully melted, and not being able to clear the streets completely makes for unsafe and really unpleasant conditions. So Debbie, that will be one of the things that you'll be figuring out that with the chief, with Paul, and with myself, and then we push it out and communicate it with people as quickly as possible. Since we're discussing it, Chief, Paul, is there anything you want to say about it, giving people a heads up, or?
Well, I can tell you that as we started doing last year, I really have very little issue with erring on the side of being conservative and calling the emergency, even if we don't end up getting the snow we thought we were going to get, because it always ends up to be a better product regardless. The other thing that we do, because some people become used to the signs on their streets and they just become indifferent to them, and they get used to seeing it every day. It's to the point where it's not there. So the police do typically supplement the permanent signs with the temporary signs that they post with sticks, and they tack it up, and it's basically a paper sign that calls for no parking with the dates written in. They do it there, and they also do the same thing during events like that on roads that might not be enveloped in the snow emergency, where we plan on doing some snow removal. And we'll post that in advance to allow for towing if necessary, but most of the time we get fairly good cooperation. So I don't know if Chief wants to supplement anything I just said.
Or if there are any lessons learned from past years on how we communicated, or do we feel like things have been getting better and better?
People do find a place to go. That's the nice thing. It's not like real people are really hard pressed to find a place to move their car. It's just that they have to walk a little bit. Is at the end of the day what the end result is. But it is nice when they get off the main corridors and allow the plows to push back to the curb. And it is nice when they abide by the signs and allow us to do snow removal when it's necessary, because it really it benefits everybody at the end of the day. It benefits the business district, where we do the primary snow removal for parking for shoppers and people that work there, and it benefits people on the when we do snow removal or snow emergency routes to go back and park on Ferris, for example, because when we can't get people off the road when we go through there, that snow sits there, and it's frustrating. And the last piece before I turn it over to Kevin, because I can feel him behind me here, is the other thing that we really have to focus on is public outreach. Is after we do all this removal, or after the snowstorm is over, when the contractors come, there's the continuous battle of them pushing it back in the road, and that's very frustrating, because they're not going to come back and take care of it. We try to tell people not to do that, but at the end of the day, some people just have no place to put it. So instead of doing their own snow removal, they do push it back in the road. So that's a continual battle there, but that's really where we have our best police involvement for next year, would be with that effort.
If you want.
I look forward to looking and just learning about what we do here in Ossining, but I've lived in a lot of snowy places, so snow removal is not really different anywhere else that you go. It's really the same type of thing, so we'll do a really good job of outreach. It'll be good.
Do you want to say anything about enforcement? Because I know one of the headaches is people, you have this beautiful black street, and suddenly people just shovel a bunch of snow into the middle of it. And then
No, I only want to add is
snow
that
on their street.
before I came here, I was at a neighborhood meeting where we had a lengthy conversation about Trustee Codman and his
Troublemaker that he is.
misunderstanding about the snow emergency signs on his block. But the residents on Ferris Place are abundantly clear about snow emergency now. We were actually meeting about other topics, but we had a discussion. No, I think over the years, especially with Paul and I working together, it was really good to start calling these things earlier and earlier, and that we've people have sort of gotten in the rhythm and used to and have an expectation for what we do. So giving them overnight and early. And there was a time when I came here where we used to declare these things at midnight and drive down the street with sirens waking everybody up to tell them they've got to come out. And wasn't always the best way we do it, but these days calling it early the day before, and people will say there's no snow on the ground yet, and then it comes and they go, now it makes sense. So I think we've got a good system, and we just continually work to try and make it better every time.
Great. You're good. Thank you very much.
Thank
Madam
you.
Manager. Is there anything else to discuss now? Otherwise, I'm going to ask for a motion to go into executive session for discussions of real property and personnel related to specific persons.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And with that, I say thank you very much for joining us for the work session. And we look forward to seeing folks next week at the legislative session, where we will address this snow and ice removal, as well as a bunch of other great stuff. And of course, that will be at the courthouse on Spring Street. This meeting is adjourned for executive session.